Welcome back to a new episode of my video course about CRUD applications with Spring Boot 2.2, Java 11 and H2. In this episode we will cover reading entities, and like in the previous section I will first start with the tests. Here for reading entities I will use JUnit 5. Then I will add the endpoints for both reading one specific entity and reading all entities. Then I'll add the business logic for both of these endpoints, and last but not least, I will use Postman, or in this case we can also use the browser, as we're just firing GET requests to manually verify that both of our endpoints are working. So let's start. First, as I said, I want to add the test that we're doing test-driven development. So our first test will be about verifying that when we are calling the API/books endpoint, we will get all books that are available in the database. So create the test. All book endpoints should return. Let's say we have 2 books, so we want 2 books. First of all, we have to mock our book service that it's returning statically 2 books in this case. So let's say here get all books. This method currently does not exist, so we have to first create it. Let's do it here and return book, a list of books. To avoid compilation errors, we can say return null here and import list. So here, let's say, and return list of, and here I'm creating a little helper method to create book entities. Let's call it create book, has the primary constructor, the title, the author, and the ISBN in this case, just a dummy number. So this method is not present, so create it here, and it returns book. So this is ID, this is a title, this is the author, and this is the ISBN. The method is pretty straightforward. We are just creating the book entity and setting the attributes which are passed to this method. And this one is, in this case we have to manually set the ID for our entity, as we are not really retrieving the data from the database, as this is a unit test and we are just covering the web layer. So in this case we have to set the book ID so that the entity got all its values initialized. And here the ISBN. In the end we will return the entity. So nice. Now we can use this method twice. Let's say we want to create a new book and call it Java EE8 with a new ISBN and the same author. So now for mock MVC, we want to perform a GET request to API/books in the first case. And now we have to specify what we expect. In this case, first of all, we have to expect that the status of the response is okay, so it's 200. Next, we want to expect that the content type we are getting is application JSON. Here we have first to add the exception. So content type result matches is correct. And here we can specify application JSON. And next we can do some JSON path assertion so that the returning JSON object is correct and has 2 books. So the first JSON path exception could be that we expect that our array has 2 entities, so the size is 2 in this case, as we return statically 2 books within this test, so it should always be 2. Next, I would say we can expect the data format for the first object. If this is correct with JSON path, we can now access one entity explicitly, here the first one, and let's say the title attribute has to be Java 11, as we specified it above. The next assertion is for the author, and in this case it has to be Duke. The next ISBN, here we set this number, and last but not least, the ID field, which has to be present, is not a string but a number and should be 1. So that's the first test. Let's run it. But I think you might know what the outcome is. It should be failing test, the 404, as this endpoint is currently not present. But let's see. Or in this case, it wasn't 404 not found, but it was 405, as we currently have some endpoints mapped, or some methods mapped to this endpoint, but in this case, it's just the post method from our previous video. So that's okay. Our test is failing and we have to fix it later on with our code. For the next test, I want to verify that if I pass on specific ID to our get endpoint, I will get the specific book. And in the case the book does not exist, I want to get 404 not found, which I will also add a test later on for this. So let's first add the first test for the good path or the happy path. Let's say get book with ID 1 should return a book. For the test setup, it's quite similar to our previous one, so I'll copy it to be a little bit more faster. In this case, we will not call get all books, but rather get book by ID. And let's pass the 1 here. That's okay. Create the method. Make it this long and call it ID. For the start, just return null here. So here we will not return a list, but rather one specific entity, so I can return the second one. and just return the Java 11 book in this case. So that's okay. Here again, add the exception to the method. And I will not call this endpoint, but rather this. I will pass 1 to specify that I only want to get the book with the ID 1 in this case. Here we also don't have an array as a return type. It's just one object. So I can verify that the title, author, and ISBN is the same as I defined it here above. So this should work. The next endpoint, not the endpoint, the test should now verify that if I pass a ID which a book is not present with this ID in the database, the endpoint should return 404 and our client should be notified that for this ID no book currently exists. So let's write a test for it. Let's call this method getBook with unknown ID should return, say, 404. Okay. In this case, we can also copy the setup. And here, let's say someone calls it with 42. Then we will not return something, but rather throw. We can specify an exception we want to throw when our service is called with this ID. For here, I will create our own exception. Let's call it book not found exception. Let's say here book ID 42 not found. We have to create this exception first. So create it. And let's extend here runtime exception and pass the string with just a message to our super constructor. So should be enough. That's okay. And here when we perform our get with the ID 42, we expect not is okay, but rather is not found. So the rest is not present, so we can delete it. And that's it for the two additional tests. One is verifying that if we pass a valid ID, we will get exactly this book. And the second one is testing if we are asking for a book with an unknown ID, we will get 404. So let's jump into our book controller and add these two endpoints, which should be really quick. So the first one is get mapping. We will return a response entity of list book. Let's say get all books. Nothing is passed here from the client, so no method arguments. And for the return type, we can say return OK of book service, get all books. So that's all we need. We now have to go to our service class and implement it here. This is also pretty straightforward as we just can delegate this request to our repository and say find all, and this method will return an empty array if there is no entity present in the database, and otherwise all entities which are present. So that's okay. For the second endpoint, we now have to specify that the client can path a path variable, the ID in this case, and for the return type we will not return a list of books rather than one specific book. Let's call it get book by ID. In this case, the client will path something, so we have to map the ID here. We can do with a path variable, let's say long ID. Default is if this matches here, the name of the attribute matches the name here, it's automatically mapped by Spring, but we can also specify it here to be more specific or explicit. So this will map the ID field to this property. And here we can also just delegate this call to our service class. Get book by ID and pass it here. Let's go here to our service and see how we can do it. First, we will use our book repository to query the database. There is one method already present. We don't have to add something. It's find by ID. We can pass our primary key here, and this method returns a optional, let's call it request book. And to check whether there is a book in this optional or not, we first have to say is empty, so this will return true if for the requested ID no book is found in the database, and in this case we want to throw our created exception. We can use string format here to format the message a little bit and say make it a generic book with ID not found and pass the ID here. So that's okay. And for the case that a book is present in the database, can just return it. Let's say requested book dot get. That should be everything for the book service. For the exception, we can make use of a Spring annotation which will map the exception to a specific response type. We specify here with the response status annotation, and we can say if this exception is thrown as it is a runtime exception and not catched in our source code, we can say HTTP status of not found. So you could also specify 500 here, but I think not found is the right HTTP method for this scenario, as there is no book present for this ID. So that should be all we need to add. We can now run all our tests and see if they pass. The first test should definitely pass, as we created it in our previous section. And the other one, as you see it here, also all are green. So our specified behavior here in the test is also met with our source code, so everything is fine. For the last step, we can boot the whole container and see if everything is working by using Postman. You could also go to browser of your choice and call this endpoints, as these are just get endpoints, but I will use Postman to show you how to do this. As our application initializes 10 books on every start, we don't have to manually put a new book into our database. We can query it from the beginning. So what we can do, we can specify our endpoint here, API books, and say we want get method, call it, and wait for the result. And here you will see we get 10 books returned with the IDs from 1 to 10. So we can start off with asking for just the book with the ID 1. So that is working. Let's try 6. Also working. And try it with a number which is not present in the database, 42. And that's what we expect. We will see here the status is 404 not found. And it's also returning some message. Could configure, but for this sample application, it's okay. What we can now also do is test it in combination with our first endpoint. So let's first create a book. Use the endpoint from the previous episode. The ISBN is too long here. Let's do it like this. So we get 201 created, and in the header section, we now get the endpoint for retrieving this book, and we can pass it here. And that's working. So we're getting 200 OK with the ID 11 and with the data we passed with the previous post method. So that's also working. That's all for the third episode about reading entities. See you in the next one, where we will cover updating our books. See you.